I've had a few people ask me about psychological types. So I wanted to share how I think about Jung's functions and polarities and how those living dynamics show up in how I work with art therapy too. It's not just about creating art, but about sensing, movement, and engaging with symbols and with meaning. Welcome to Chiron Art Therapy. I'm Maggi Colwell, an art therapist and Jungian. Here we explore archetypal images, personal symbolism in art and dreams, and what your psyche is trying to tell you. If you're ready to dive into your inner world, you're in the right place. Subscribe, and let's begin. I'd had a couple people ask me to talk about psychological types a little bit, and I think the one that most people are familiar with is the idea of extroversion and introversion. We live, at least those of us who live in the US, live in a society that values a couple things: sports and like physicality from a sensing perspective. We value extroversion, and most of the world thinks that Americans are very extroverted, upfront, forthright, kind of loud and talkative. And the other piece of that is thinking. I was saying earlier that I'd done a presentation for a bunch of students at a local university. And when you start asking them for paying attention to what does that feel like in your body, or do you have an emotional reaction to that, they stare at you with a completely blank look on their face. Because when we're in class, they are completely in cognitive mode of like, what are the words here? What do I memorize? Like linear thinking and trying to cut off, like, what is your emotional experience? I experienced that when I was in corporate America before I became an art therapist, where you're really supposed to be an automaton. And too bad if you have energy fluctuations throughout the month, like many of us do, or if you have an emotional reaction to something, or you have something going on at home that is emotional, or even if you have a problem with something. I found very early on in insurance that there's no crying in insurance. And I don't think that's true. I think we should be whole human beings as we interact with each other. And I think that's going to give us more of a connection to what it really is to be human as we move forward with society. I think it's crucial. So let me give you a little bit of the framework of what I want to talk about today. I want to start with this one statement that really differentiated Freud and Jung, as Jung was not sticking to what Freud was really trying to impress upon him of Freud's sexual theory. Freud was very extroverted. He was also very atheist. And so he really had a lot of power in the psychology club and within academia at the time, and really wanted to push his theories. This greatly influenced the medical model in psychiatric and psychological healing, of focusing solely on pathology. And Jung said, no, that's not all there is. Symbols are giving us a teleological story of what is the unfolding process of a person, not just symbols relating to repressed thoughts or feelings and symptoms. He said there's a lot more going on. And he saw that when you looked at patients' behavior with mythology, fairy tales, and onward. So here's my question here. Jung tried to be broader and kind of integrate the full list of human experiences. So my question is, if we can notice patterns going on in a person's life, or if there seems to be a teleological aim that isn't quantifiable or generalizable, does it still exist? Are emotions, meaning, and intuition and meaning important to the human experience rather than from a reductive, concrete standpoint? So that's my question on that. The story of where Jung started to create some of this stuff for himself was that when he decided to finally break with Freud over those issues and an interpretation of one of Jung's dreams, he went into a depression. He was starting his own practice. He was seeing patients. He was working at the Wellesley Hospital, doing research. He was publishing, very, very busy and depressed. and finally got to a point where I have to surrender to whatever's in the unconscious right now and figure out what was going on within him. While he was doing this, he had noticed that a lot of patients, as they start to get better, would draw circles and things that were similar to mandala patterns. His exact quote is, "I sketched every morning in a notebook a small circular drawing, a mandala, which seemed to correspond with my inner situation at the time." And he would look at that at the end of the day and try to connect what had gone on through the day as related to what his psychic situation was in the beginning, which led him to doing active imagination, this kind of dialoguing, imaginative work with his images, with his internal feeling states that were bubbling up from the unconscious, which became the Red Book. He worked on that, and it looks like a medieval illustrated manuscript. He worked on it for 17 years, and most of his theories come out of that. You even see the beginning of psychological types in the Red Book as well. So a lot of how I work with people is trying to have this same kind of curiosity of trying to hold your attention to your artwork and dialogue with it to see what meaning it has for you, and possibly what part of your complexes are talking to you. When you do that, pay attention to sensation inside your body. It's as if you are listening to both your body as well as the artwork and saying what's going on here and being curious. It's a way of holding your attention and being curious rather than a directed linear thought process. So here was my first question, the prompt for how you could start this whole process that Jung was doing. You can just circle like a coffee cup or a bowl or something like that to be able to give yourself a container to start just saying, what's in here? How do I talk to myself? How do I talk to my body and the sensations that are coming up? It's not a linear process. It's a process of listening. And this is something you could do every day. This is something you could do twice a day. You could set a timer, say, I'm only going to spend 5 minutes on this, or 15. That would be completely up to you. It doesn't have to be complicated. So let me go into kind of some levels with art therapy that kind of broadens what you might consider to be art, because art therapy is looking at a lot of different levels. At the lowest level, we're looking at both your senses, so what you see, what you're hearing, the texture of things, what you're experiencing in the environment, smells, sounds, other people, as well as what you're experiencing inside of yourself. I'm often giving people word banks of sensing words just to be able to notice, how does my body change? Am I noticing my body? And the other side of that is kinesthetic, of movement. A lot of the art that we do is more about movement with your body than it is actually making anything. And that can be a really great way to work out stuck emotions and to work out trauma. On the next level, we're looking at the affect or the emotions. So for somebody who has stuck emotions that isn't really connected with them, I might use a very fluid material that helps get that kind of flow. For somebody who has already been crying a lot, we might use dry materials to help them feel like they have more control. The perceptual piece is about the formal art qualities of it. Where's the movement? Where's the rhythm? Is it heavy? What's the weight? How much space is there? Those kind of qualities, so that you can kind of take a little bit of a distance and say, what's going on here? What are the qualities of what it's representing? The symbolic level, I talk about that all the time, of things carrying a metaphor for something else. And that might be the complex, and it might be information from the unconscious trying to get your attention. We don't always know what it is, and sometimes holding that curiosity and not knowing is more helpful than anything else. And the other piece is cognitive. What do you consciously think about it? So there's that thinking level. And when we're able to kind of move back and forth on this continuum, that's when we describe a place of flow that feels like everything's connected. So I want to layer over top of what I just talked about with Jung's ideas. So, extroversion goes out into the world. It involves projection and interacting with people and objects outside of yourself. On this middle red axis going down, we think about introversion, and that's turning inward. It's paying attention to what's going on inside. So that might be an internal thought process, emotions, what your intuition is telling you, really chewing on and metabolizing ideas. It's also the ones that are creatively, imaginatively from an internal place. So it's those random thoughts that you didn't know where they came from. We have everyday thoughts that happen all the time, and then we have kind of creative thoughts that you're like, oh, that was different. But the thing is, with those kind of things, if you don't pay attention to them, they go away. Or if there's too much noise outside of yourself, you don't notice it. And hopefully you're starting to see how different this concept is than maybe what's been I can't say that word, popularized in our culture. That it's not about hiding and it's not about not being able to be social. It's about paying attention to inner objects, inner figures in your dreams, symbolism, ideas, emotions, that internal process, rather than looking at it outside of yourself. So, another piece that he talked about was thinking, and that's our active cognition. That's linear thought, that's rationality. And then feeling is kind of that bubbling up of what is the emotion related to this. And you don't necessarily have to have words and be able to put a label on it to know that it's emotional and that it's giving you information. That's that second piece of it. Another piece is intuition and sensing, where sensing is giving you information related to your senses, whether it's internal senses or external senses. So concrete, what you feel, what your body feels in space, haptic reality. And people who are very good at a sensing function are usually really good at concrete tasks as well as athleticism. I have really enjoyed getting to know people who teach yoga and are very aware of shifts in how their body works and how it works in space, just because I am not that aware of my body and it takes work. And finally, intuition. And that is when you are able to come to a conclusion on a pattern and make a judgment call from it. And it's irrational. That doesn't mean that it's delusional. So you're making complex judgments based on different pieces of information. And some people are incredibly good at this and can make very quick judgments on the information that they're receiving. For those of you who are familiar with Myers-Briggs, this is kind of taking Jung's concepts of these different functions and kind of categorizing them into 16 different buckets. The way that we're taught about it, at least in Zurich right now, they talk about I think it's AGI compass gifts. I would have to look at the exact acronym for it. But it's given to us in a mandala of these are your different strengths. These are the preferred functions that you really enjoy. And based on the ones that you don't enjoy or spend less time actively with, that's in your shadow. And that's still worth knowing the polarity. And they're kind of arranged on this pie to show you what the balance is. So the one that you're most comfortable with is called your dominant function. And then from that, you figure out what your latent function is, and that's the one you're least comfortable with, and that's the one that you have to spend more work on. It's also the one that your shadow or repressed material winds up coming up and catching you unawares. I am an intuitive thinker, and from that, the biggest movements of psyche in my life, moving me, slamming the door in my face, tripping me, telling me to go in a completely different direction, usually happens from a very large emotional reaction. And I find it very uncomfortable and have to figure out if something in the unconscious is moving. This is shadow kind of stuff. What do I do with it? That's going to be different for every person. But I want you to think about it from a polarity and something that shifts. Hopefully, as people get older, they become more comfortable with their inferior and latent functions, and you wind up becoming more balanced. For example, I was very introverted as a child, and I found social interaction very overwhelming. But as I've gotten older, I've gotten more comfortable with it. And some people think I'm extroverted, which I kind of find funny. But the idea is that as we mature, we do find more balance and that we can use the other side of each one of those spectrums more. And the balanced person would be somewhere in between on all of those spectrums. One thing that's also, I think, worth saying is that a lot of Jungian psychology is based on the introversion process, where when Jung was about 35 to 37 in that time period, he started moving toward, how do I turn toward my inner figures? What's going on here? How do I really digest what my reactions are and what's moving me, and how to be more balanced? So that introversion process is about really understanding our inner world. In an extreme, we see this with people at the last years of their life, where they are less out in the world and spend more time inside, less active, may have less, their range in the world starts to get smaller. And you see that some even with certain disease processes where somebody, maybe they're sleeping more, or I'm also thinking about different types of dementia, such as Parkinson's, where there's a turning inward and less verbalization and a kind of introjection to how they are able to interact with the rest of the world as well. So that's kind of an interesting part of that process as well. I'm happy to answer questions, but I really want us to kind of think about this as dynamic rather than this is my type, as you might with Myers-Briggs. The idea of teleological means that there is an aim or an outcome, that there is a purpose unfolding and moving a person's life forward. That rather than just looking at pathology and being able to define everything, it's also being able to look forward and say, what is this pattern moving toward? What is the story that's unfolding? What is the mythology of this person? So the exact definition here at the bottom is that teleological is concerned with purpose, goal, or end results rather than with causes. It comes from the Greek telos, meaning end or goal. And one of Jung's key ideas was in individuation, is that as a person gets to know themselves better and unfolds the teleological progress that they have made in their life, that they are becoming more and more of manifesting their unique self, their individual nature. And that a lot of the idea in Jungian psychology is that we are born with very particular archetypal potentialities, that as we continue throughout our life, we are hoping to live those more balanced and unfolding patterns as we mature. If they're thinking about therapy as what's wrong with me and what am I suffering from, only pathos, that maybe it's more about self-knowledge and meaning and context and balancing out things that are in an imbalance, so that we're moving more toward that, being able to use all parts of human functionality in a balanced way. So it really is about wellness and meaning, and rather than just fix what's wrong, get rid of my symptoms. Some of Jung's ideas on the West were highly influenced by bad translations by armchair anthropologists. And the good thing is that as Jungians move forward, we have more background and more information on doing justice to the culture which wisdom has come from. And we're updating kind of our collective perspective on it, just because like Jung was a forerunner, but certainly had a limited viewpoint too. So that's something to keep in mind if you're trying to wade through Jung. So I was saying that a lot of people think I'm extroverted, even though that's not my natural inclination. Determining whether or not you're extroverted or introverted is based on where do you get your energy from.
Yeah.
Extroverted people enjoy being in crowds, in large parties, really just get like filled up from social gatherings. And we're really suffering during COVID because there was a lot less socializing to go on and there was a distance from Zoom formats. And introverts recharge by themselves, doing things by themselves, like, reading, painting, just putzing around, working on little projects, those sorts of things. And it doesn't mean that introverts can't be social and that extroverts can't do things by themselves. That's a oversimplification. It's more of where do you get your energy from and where do you recharge? I can certainly be in social settings and then I go home and hide from the world. There's kind of an idea of we forget ourselves or we forget what our core patterns or meanings are. And then we have to, it's like we remember, we come back to it and keep on returning to center. So it's a process of forgetting, remembering, and returning over and over again. And I feel those kind of practices give us a opportunity to return and remember and reconnect with our own physical self. I think people who are naturally sensing types sometimes get kind of brushed over in academic settings because so much of it is thought driven that sometimes they need to sit and kind of work things out of how it feels in their bodies for a while before they have a way to process it and have something to say later, but it may take time. And it's not that kind of mercurial speed of one idea to the next. And it has kind of a deepening and an embodiment piece of it that we could all use. And I'm intuitive. Like I'm going from one idea to the next, and it's still a very kind of like circuitous route that's fast, and I have to remember to slow down. The way I was taught types at the Institute, it's called the Gifts Compass Inventory, a GCI, and I will give you a link to that. It's the assessment tool that we were taught at the Institute to look at what your different preferred psychological types are. And it's based on what you prefer, not necessarily based on what you, some outer tool saying what you are. And I just found this more useful than Myers-Briggs because I feel like it's more dynamic and there's more polarity there for you to really look at that kind of dynamism that we were talking about. This has more room for differences and preferences than what those 16 kind of buckets are, because that's kind of static. So I wanted to share that as well if you're interested in plotting out where you are right now. You'll see the functions in dreams too, which is really interesting. And if you notice that you don't see a certain function in a dream, then I start asking, what's the emotion? Or it might be a suppression, and it's saying like, what's the suppressed emotion here? With this situation, what should be the emotion? That's always a fun one, because sometimes there's one that's missing because it's been suppressed or because of trauma. Some dreams are very sensory, and that's an important part of connecting back with your body to try to get the information from your sensory reaction, your literal feeling inside your body to the dream as well. rather than just content. They use all of those functions as a full carrier of human experience rather than just an idea.